Covenants. Covenants are agreements that God makes. And so there are a number of covenants within the Bible. And what I want to talk about is not covenant theology, because that's a man-made structure in which they are placing ideas to understand how God relates to us. I want to talk about the biblical covenants, and particularly the covenant that I want to talk about is the Mosaic covenant. Because within the Mosaic covenant there are a lot of rules and regulations, and the question that we have, does it relate to us or apply to us? And I'll address more of that tomorrow as well, when I particularly look at is Christ the end of the law? And which law? And do we uphold the law? And is the law good and holy? And those kind of questions. Now the covenants, though, are split up into two ways. Conditional and unconditional. And that's relatively simple to look at by saying, are there rules and regulations that they must do to receive the fullness of that covenant? Now there are covenants made with all of humanity, and that's the covenant with Adam inside the Garden of Eden, usually called the Edenic covenant, and the one when he was kicked out of the garden, called the Adamic covenant. Now in Hosea 6, it does mention the word covenant, while in those Genesis passages, 1 to chapter 3, it doesn't. But in Hosea 6 it does. So that's where you'll find that Israel, like Adam, broke the covenant. So that's that key reference. Then God made a covenant with Noah, and again, Noah stands as a representative of all of humanity. And that's not where I want to go tonight, because while it's a great covenant and worthy for our study, it goes beyond us. But most of the covenants are specifically with the nation of Israel. And the covenants that God has made with the nation of Israel are, first of all, the Abrahamic covenant. We can go to the next slide. And the major scripture reference would be Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. But you'll also find it in Genesis 13, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. And particularly those last two chapters are full chapters full of this covenant. And it's an unconditional covenant. But in essence, the Abrahamic covenant promises three things: a land, a seed, and a blessing. Now the land is wherever he would tread, that would be his, from the river of Egypt all the way to the great river Euphrates. And you see that language coming back in the land covenant. The Davidic covenant, David is that promised seed. Initially that is Isaac, and in Galatians 3 Paul then says that seed is Christ. So we can trace that, and it's about who then owns that land, or in a relationship to that. And that runs through the Davidic covenant. And that's found in the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, you'll find that reference. 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 to 16. And then there's the new covenant. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. When we read it there, it's a very Jewish covenant, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. But what I want you to see from this structure is that one overarching covenant with three covenants underneath that all relate to the themes that are within that one covenant. The Abrahamic covenant is unconditional, made with Abraham, and the provision is that the land would be his, that he would have a seed, and that there would be a blessing, and that blessing is then the new covenant. Let's go to the next slide. The one covenant that I haven't mentioned is the Mosaic covenant, and it runs from Exodus 19 all the way forwards to Deuteronomy 34, with the exception of 2 chapters, which are the land covenant. The land covenant is found in Deuteronomy 29 and 30, and that's a separate covenant that God makes with the nation of Israel at Moab and no longer at Mount Sinai, so it's a separate covenant. But the Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant and not an unconditional covenant. And so therefore it doesn't fit right under that structure. While it is made with the Jewish people, like the other covenants, this one is conditional. If you, then I will. And so in the book of Exodus chapter 19, where that major first reference is found, he clearly states that consistently. Verse 5, now if indeed you will keep my voice, or obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be. And then he states some of the things that they'll be. They will be if. This is the conditional covenant. And therefore it doesn't fit the pattern of the other covenants. Now I just want to show you some slides of the other covenants, and then I'll come to the last slide, and then I'll deal with our topic specifically. So the land covenant, Deuteronomy 29-30, specifically made with the nation of Israel. The provision is the land, and you can see it laid out there. And the current status is because it is an unconditional covenant that it still needs to be fulfilled. Think about it. Initially it was promised to Abraham, and what did Abraham own in the land? All the land where your foot will go, where your foot will tread, that is yours. But how much did he own? A burial cave at Machpelah where he buried his wife. So that means that God at some stage has to fulfill his promise. Unless God is a liar, and that's not God. He is the God of truth and not the God of lies. And so that means that God at some stage has to raise Abraham back to life and give him the land. I'm waiting for that day, I have to be honest, because I'd like to know where I'm going to be living here. He's going to raise him, and he's going to be owning the land. Now, we'll look at that later. Christ will be king over all the earth, specifically king over Israel, but people always have some rights within this land, and Abraham will have rights to this land, as will King David. Zerubbabel is one of the other people mentioned specifically in connection with the land. In the next slide, you'll see the covenant with David and the major reference, 2 Samuel chapter 7. And it is made with David and his descendants. And it is a significant covenant because for most of the church, we don't quite get how significant this covenant is. What we have here is that God promised him an eternal kingdom. An eternal house, eternal seat. Well, the eternal seat will ultimately be Christ, the Messiah. Because of his eternality, he can have that kingdom forever. And he's the only one that can actually occupy that land and that throne permanently. It's not just found in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament where we see this. Because even the angels said to Mary that he would be sitting on the throne of David. So it's not just an Old Testament thing, it's actually an Old and New Testament thing. And a part of this fulfillment will be, again, within the millennial kingdom, when Christ will reign over all the earth. And because this covenant has never been fulfilled, because while Christ may reign in our hearts, that doesn't make him king. He may be your king, and he may be my king. But was he crowned? Psalm 2 tells us that he will be crowned at Mount Zion. That has never happened. So much of this covenant is still to come. And therefore, when we, together with the Abrahamic covenant and the land covenant, we push this forward, we see that during the millennial reign, the land covenant and the Davidic covenant come together. Now, all of that comes together in the new covenant. And the new covenant is found in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. There's a whole lot of small references as well. I won't go into that. But over there, it specifically states that this is the covenant that God makes with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Who does he not make any of the covenants with? Yeah, the church. So how do we as a church relate to these covenants? In Ephesians 2 and 3, it talks about that. That though the Gentiles were far off, they've now been brought near by the blood of Christ. And they've become members of the Commonwealth of Israel. Now, they didn't become Jewish. They didn't become Israel. They became members of the Commonwealth. Just like you and I are members of the Commonwealth of Australia. And we have some relationship back to the United Kingdom, isn't it? That's part of the Commonwealth. We didn't become British, but we are in a relationship through the Commonwealth. So too the church is in a relationship with the covenant God of Israel through the new covenant. And because the new covenant hasn't been fulfilled, because every man will know the Lord. Well, that hasn't happened to Israel and it hasn't happened to us. So that's certainly still in the future to come. When Christ will reign over all the earth, we will all look towards him as our king. And as such, that's what we're waiting for. And so when we look at the last slide that I have before I tackle then the topic that I want to deal with, what we see is that the Abrahamic covenant forms that foundation for 3 more covenants, but not the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant is replaced by the new covenant. Now, I grew up Jewish. I can't help that. When I studied with the rabbis, I was told the eternal covenant is the Mosaic covenant. And that covenant was given by God to Adam all the way forwards, but only written down at the time of Moses. And that whenever Messiah comes, we'll still have to obey that. I assumed that that was truth. But it's a conditional covenant that actually came at an end with the death of Christ. How does that work? One of the major problems that some people have today, like I did then when I became a believer, about that eternality of this covenant is, are we under law? Are we under grace? Are we under both? Or what is it that we're under? How does that work? Well, we're both under law and under grace. Salvation was always by faith through grace, nothing more, nothing less. What Old Testament saints had to believe and what we had to believe might be slightly different. And the rule that they had to apply to their life was different for Adam, as it was for Noah, as it was for Moses and King David, as it is for us. And it will be true that it will be different again when he will reign upon all the earth. And so there are always different law codes, but there's always a law. We're never lawless. Leviticus 19 says to the Jewish people that they're not allowed to glean to the corners of their field. So they're not allowed to harvest the corners of their field. Now, is that law? Yeah, if you're the landowner, that is law. But if you're the poor, the orphan, the widow, you're allowed to glean those corners. And what is that to you? Grace. Law and grace are therefore not a dichotomy against each other. They work hand in hand. And so God will have always a law for us. But which law? That's the key. We are not lawless. We do have a law, but the question is which one? And so what I want to do tonight is deal with the Mosaic covenant, because that's where the most confusion lies. And one of the problems that the rabbis had over this whole Mosaic covenant in relationship to the new covenant was when they looked at the book of Ezekiel. In the book of Numbers, chapters 28 and 29, it talks about the festival offerings that were made by Israel. But when we look at the book of Ezekiel, chapters 45 and 46, we notice something odd. And what we notice is that the festivals are different, who offers them are different, and what is being offered is different. And for a number of years and a number of debates, the rabbis actually said, maybe we shouldn't have the book of Ezekiel in our Bible because of these differences, and they couldn't reconcile them. And even today, that is kind of an issue in the Jewish community, because if the law of Moses is eternal, then that's an issue. If God always has a code of law for us, it's not an issue, because then that just applies to a new law code. Now, the Mosaic covenant is found in Exodus 19 to Deuteronomy 34, with the exceptions of those two chapters of Deuteronomy 29 and 30, when he talks about the land covenant. And the participants are God and Israel, and it's mediated through Moses. And so in Exodus 19, verses 3 to 8, Moses went up to the mountain. Moses went up to the Lord, who called him and says, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourself have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my possession amongst all the peoples of all the earth. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." And so God calls all of the people together and says of them, "This is what I want you to do." Now the covenant is not made with the church. The church wasn't even in the picture. The church doesn't come into being until Acts 2. And this is restated for us in Deuteronomy 4, verses 7 and 8. Deuteronomy 4, 7 to 8. Psalm 147, verses 19 to 20. And Malachi 4:4. Malachi 4:4. All of these passages state that it is made with Israel. It is not made with the church. Now, the law of Moses had a number of commandments, and most of the time when I talk to Christians, they think there were 10 commandments. But that's not quite true. There were 613 commandments. 365 negative and 245 positive. And it is not an easy thing to keep. 75% of the Mosaic law cannot be kept today. Because we don't have a temple, we don't have a priesthood. Those two things alone causes us to realize that we cannot keep it. Turn with me, if you have a Bible, to Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus chapter 26, we see what he says about blessings and cursing. Blessings for obedience. And the blessings for obedience are very clear. Verse 3, "If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and so to carry them out, then I shall." Then he states a number of things that he says, "I will give you." And he will give you rain, he will give you material blessings. In verses 6 to 10, he even says, "I will give you peace in the land from the animals and from the enemies." And so God clearly says that, but what they need to do is turn towards him. But the longer passage, verses 14 to 39, are actually curses. Curses for disobedience, if you don't. If you were under a covenant and you could choose to be a covenant, wouldn't you choose to be under a covenant that says God will, rather than if you, and if you don't, then I will? Because God is now actually saying, if you don't obey and if you don't listen, then I will, and I will punish you severely. And what we see are 5 different kinds of punishments. In verses 16 to 17, he says there'll be illness and enemies, both internal affliction and external affliction. Verses 18 to 20, we see drought and famine. The land of milk and honey will now be a pest to you. Verses 21 to 22, it says there'll be wild animals and you'll be childless. Verses 23 to 26, pestilence and wars. And verses 27 to 33, he says devastation, deportation, and dispersion. And if we think about the nation of Israel, where are they in this step? Are they having peace in the land? Are they having material prosperity? Sure. But peace in the land? No. Why not? Because they are not walking in the covenant. If this covenant was an eternal covenant and God had to judge them on this, they would be in devastation, in pestilence and wars. They would be in dispersion. And more than half the people are still outside of the land. In Isaiah 11, it actually talks about two regatherings, two worldwide regatherings. If they were faithful, they would be in the land. But if they were be unfaithful, they would be scattered outside of the land, recalled, only to be rescattered. And that's what we see now. We're seeing them being gathered for the first time, but not in blessing. It is actually for a horrific curse. And that's not what I want for my people. I want them to be blessed. And the only way for them to be blessed is to understand that the Abrahamic covenant is the eternal covenant, with those other covenants, particularly the new covenant, being the blessing coming underneath. Now, this covenant is a blood covenant, and this is the most severe covenant that there is. There are a number of covenants described in the Bible, from a hand covenant in the book of Ezra, for instance, and it would be like a handshake that you and I do. A shoe covenant that is found in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, where a shoe would have been exchanged, or a sandal would have been exchanged for a piece of land. Slide us up. Very good. He's amazing, isn't he?
He's a keeper.
He is a keeper. Keep him. The next covenant down would be the salt covenant. And the salt covenant is when two people would meet and they would have salt in a pouch with them. And they would exchange with each other some grains of salt. And if they could exchange that same amount of salt back, then they would consider that covenant be breakable. But otherwise it would be a permanent covenant. And God calls the Davidic covenant a salt covenant. And so it is a permanent covenant. But the most severe covenant is the blood covenant. And what you would normally do is cut up an animal and walk with the two partners in between the animals. God does that to Abraham, but Abraham is not a partner with God because Abraham is only the recipient of an unconditional blessing. So he doesn't walk through it, but God walks through it. And so God takes upon himself all the responsibilities, but the blessings are then still extended to that second partner, and that is Abraham. The Mosaic covenant is a blood covenant, and we see that in Leviticus 17, verse 11. And there the blood is mentioned specifically because it makes atonement for the life. And because of that, it is a binding covenant for the Jewish people at this time. And in Exodus 19, Exodus 20, we see that Moses even sprinkles or splatters the blood. More literal, it says he tosses the blood upon the people. And lots of sacrifices were being made at the time, and he would have then gone around and splattered the people with blood, indicating, may we become like those dead animals that we've just cut open if we break this covenant. Now the problem is that in Jeremiah 31, God says that the covenant is broken. The covenant was broken even before then. Remember that Moses went up the mountain and he came down, and what did he see? That golden calf, isn't it? At that point it is already broken, and God then reinstitutes the tabernacle, because that's why we have those two blockends on that golden calf incident. Introduction to the tent of meeting, and then the confirmation of it, or the reconfirmation. Blood is therefore not allowable for people to eat. And this is true under the Noahic covenant. And so that is still binding for us today. It's even in the new covenant. It's found in the book of Acts, where even to the church it is told it's not allowed to have this. But the death penalty that was in the Noahic covenant only if you had murdered somebody is now extended under the Mosaic covenant. In the Mosaic covenant, if I cursed my parents, they could have said, let's stone the boy. Well, I don't know about you, but have you seen anybody stoned within the church today? If we take the law, it is one law. The word Torah is in the singular. Greek would be nomos, it's in the singular. Therefore, all 613 commandments are upon us. Think about that for a second. I break the law here in Australia and I go to the judge and I say, but I keep 25% of your laws. What's the judge going to say to me? Bad, exactly, bad boy. It reminds me of a joke. Abraham and Sarah haven't been to the synagogue for a long time, and they finally show up and they attend services, and the rabbi afterwards is eager to connect with them, and so he shoots out and he says, look, hey, we haven't seen you for a long time, where have you been? And he says, look, I've been busy, I've got kids and grandkids and my business, and you know what life is like. I understand. But look, Rabbi, we really liked your service today, it was great, and look, you talked about the 10 Commandments, and we keep them. Sarah usually keeps 6 and I keep the other 4. It doesn't work like that, does it? Let's be honest. When we stand before God, can we say, oh, well, I picked the ones that I liked and the ones that I didn't like, I'm going to ignore? Can't do that. The sign of the covenant is the same as the Abrahamic covenant in that it is circumcision. And that is a bit of an issue because sometimes we think, okay, so we're not allowed to circumcise our sons. Well, if you happen to be Jewish, you can circumcise your sons on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant, but not on the basis of the Mosaic covenant, because that covenant came to an end. And if you want to circumcise on that basis, you have to take on the entire law. And that would be a bad thing to do. Because of that, you see in the New Testament some issues there with Timothy and Titus, and why one of them was and one of the other ones wasn't circumcised. And then there is a token given, and that's the Sabbath. Sabbath becomes a really big issue within the Hebrew roots movement. And if you want to keep Sabbath, that's perfectly fine. If you want to keep Sunday, that would be perfectly fine. Now, I worked for a boss for about 25 years, and I said, I actually like Tuesdays off. It never happened. The reality is, all days are the same. People then try to tell me usually, well, no, hang on, God kept the Sabbath. And I always say to them, it's really simple. Give me the reference, chapter and verse, and I'll look it up for you. But it doesn't say that God kept the Sabbath. It just says that God took a day off. Yeah. And it happened to be the 7th day. But from that moment on, from Adam all the way to Moses, did anybody keep it? There's not a single record. Did Job keep it? It's not in the book. Did anybody keep it in Genesis? No, God took one day off. That's it. Well, it's got to be a holy convocation. Well, that's true. In Leviticus 23, it does state that. But who's the book of Leviticus written to? Specifically to the Jewish people, but even more so to the priest. And the priest in the tabernacle had to work. So for them, it was a holy convocation. But what about the rest of the community? They were told you were not to light a light or a light of fire. So within the Jewish community, when I studied in theological school, what did we do? We used to put a little sticker in the fridge over the little switch so that the light wouldn't come on. Now you laugh, but it's something that we did. We would tear toilet paper because you're not allowed to create a new thing. You see, what does the law actually say? Rest. Don't gather things. Don't work. And what is it that we do? We come together and we congregate. That's not what the Mosaic law tells you to do. That's the law that the rabbis made up. Well, if you want to follow rabbinical law, look, as long as it doesn't go against New Covenant or New Testament law, that's freedom. If you want to eat kosher, it's perfectly fine. But we're not under that law. That's the key for us. So Sabbath was never a day for corporate worship. That's a common misconception that started with the rabbis. Because they came and said, how do we make sure that the people follow the same laws and rules? And from there they started a whole new thing. But the synagogue Sabbath started in Babylon. And that's not a great place for holiness. So when it talks about the Holy Convocation, it really talks in Leviticus 3 that it is for the priest. And otherwise they had to stay at home and rest. Exodus 16 verse 29. Let me deal with the purpose of the law, because that'll help you and me in this whole thing. What's the purpose of the law? The law was never given as a means to salvation. The law was a rule of life for Old Testament saints from Moses onwards. Romans chapter 3 verse 20. Galatians 2:16. We're not going to be able to read all of this. I wish we did have that time, but we don't. But I will give you the references. Romans 3:20. Because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. So what is the purpose of the law? Not to justify me, but to cause me to understand that I am a sinner. So when you think about that, do I gain some holiness or righteousness or glorification or sanctification or anything like that? No, I cause the knowledge and understanding that I'm a sinner. That's what Paul is writing to us. Okay, that's not quite what I had in mind, because the law is holy and righteous and good, and that's true. But it makes me aware that I am the sinner. That's the key purpose here in Romans. It reveals that standard of righteousness that God is holy. Romans 7 verse 12. But I'm not. Let's look at Galatians. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 16. Nevertheless, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Christ Jesus. We're not justified by the works of the law. Actually, no flesh will be justified, he writes, by the law. So do I therefore throw out the whole law? No, because the law is still a tutor that leads me to Christ, and therefore can still make me aware of things that are right and wrong. That's the key for us. It was there for corporate Israel, for them to understand in terms of worship. What it did do is keep the Jewish people distinct from the Gentiles, because suddenly they had to have beards, and they couldn't eat those funny things that you like. Bacon, isn't it? Yeah, you still like it, okay. Terrible. I'm just kidding. You're free to have your bacon burger. I'll stick to the hamburger without the ham. You're free to eat them. But under Mosaic law, that's a no-no. And it kept the Jewish people distinct by various laws, from sexual laws to purity laws to beards to garments that they had to wear. It kept Jewish people distinct. But in Ephesians 2 and 3, what does Paul write to us? That middle wall of partition is now broken down. That means that the law that kept Gentiles outside of the covenant of God, outside in the cold and not being able to draw near to God, it kept them apart. Ephesians 2 and 3 tell us that that's no longer the case. And so that middle wall of partition is removed. Ephesians 2. Therefore remember that at former times you the Gentiles in the flesh who were called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, and having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one, and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of the commandments contained in the ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both into one body to God through the cross, by having to put to death the enmity. Here the law is called the enmity. It is the enmity that kept some of you Gentiles out of my relationship that I can have with God as a Jew. And what God is not the God of the Jews only, he's the God of all mankind. And he's saying, I want you to come in, no longer as a Gentile, no longer as a Jew, but as the one new man, together, because he is our peace, who broke down. He removed that middle wall of partition, that is the law and the commandments. And therefore this is now removed. Romans chapter 4:15. For the law works wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgressions. The law works wrath. He is against me, because the law condemns me consistently as a sinner. But that is now removed. But if I want to say, hey, I'm under the law of Moses, A, I can't keep most of it, and B, it is against me. The sting of death is sin, 1 Corinthians 15:56. And the power of sin is the law, because that is the basis for the operation against me. I am a sinner by nature, and this is now written against me so that I can't come together with him. Now, the law of Moses is a single unity. There are no two ways about it. I can't split it up as some theologians have done into moral categories, and we got to keep them. And there are these other categories that I'm trying to divide it up in legal ceremonies, or legal or ceremonies, and then hope that I can keep some. Because who makes that distinction? And when you read through covenant theologians who actually try to sort them out, they don't agree with one another which law fits in what category. And that's because of that quote that I gave you earlier from Leviticus 19, that it's not that simple, because some of them are law and grace at the same time. So there is only a single law, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And we cannot fudge on them. They're either all in or all out. And that's the point that James makes in chapter 2, verse 10. For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble on one point, he's guilty of breaking them all. Because there is only one law. James is saying, if I break just one of the Mosaic commandments, I'm a lawbreaker. And so if I get to my Messianic congregation on a Shabbat, and I lived under Mosaic law, and I get in my car, I'm already breaking a law there, and I get there, and I do corporate worship, which I'm not commanded, am I a law keeper? No, I'm actually a lawbreaker. Now, if I'm not under the Mosaic covenant, but under the new covenant, I have freedom to do that. And so, if you're under the Mosaic covenant, you don't. But under the new covenant, you do. You have that freedom. And there's the freedom for you and me to do these kind of things. And we can meet on a Shabbat, on a Sabbath, or we can meet on a Sunday. Did God change the day? No, Sabbath is still Sabbath, Sunday is still Sunday. That's not the issue. Do I have to keep Mosaic covenant? No. Is it repeated in the new covenant? But the only place you'll find it clearly is in the book of Hebrews, and in the book of Hebrews chapter 4, I believe, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, it does talk about the Sabbath, but it says that Christ is our Sabbath rest. 9 out of the 10 commandments are repeated to the church, but the one that is not is the Sabbath. And now they start to fight, saying, oh no, hang on, it's in the Gospels. That is true. And Paul kept it sometimes in the book of Acts. That's true. In the Gospels, all the references are either to Christ or to the disciples observing it before the institution of the new covenant, because the new covenant is instituted at the death of Christ. That's when his blood covenant, was shed for you and me. And at that point, he removed that middle wall of partition. Or, as it, for instance, in Matthew 24, that it talks about the end times. And then it talks specifically about Israel, that it will be a hard time for them, and that they hope that it's not a Sabbath on which these terrible things will happen. And that's a whole different sermon, which we won't enter into now. But the law as a whole comes to an end, and I'll deal with Romans 10, verse 4 on Sunday morning. For Christ is the end of the law unto righteousness to everyone that believes. And what that really means and how did that fit within the context. And we don't just take a pretext out of the text, but we'll deal with this at that point. Because it is clearly a termination that is happening. And in Galatians 3:19, Paul writes this, what then is the law? It was added because of transgressions until the seed should come to whom the promise has been made. And what Paul is writing here is that the Mosaic covenant is that addition to the Abrahamic covenant. And that covenant, therefore, is replaced by the new covenant. If you're under the Mosaic covenant, and I hope that none of you think that you are the case, think through the book of Hebrews. What is it that we have in the book of Hebrews? A new high priest. We're not under Aaronic priesthood. New priesthood. Melchizedek in order. We have a new high priest, not in the line of Aaron, but Christ himself. We have a new sacrificial system and a new sacrifice. Christ our sacrifice. If that's the case, then the whole law of Moses falls suddenly apart because the guts of it is found in the book of Leviticus. How do I deal with that now? Therefore, I need to press in, as it says in Hebrews 4, press in. And not be like that wicked generation that was thinking, maybe I'll go back under the Mosaic law and I think I can get away with that. Because that generation is compared back to the book of Numbers, to chapter 14, where there that Exodus generation and the wilderness generation, the Exodus generation that could not get into the promised land because of the 12 spies and the 10 spies who came back and gave a bad report at Kadesh Barnea. And you don't want to be in that generation, losing the blessing that God has promised. What we have is a new priesthood. In Hebrews chapter 7, verse 18, it even says that the law was annulled, and therefore it is no longer operative. The law of Moses became old, and it became old in the days of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. But now with the death of Messiah has vanished away. And so you and I, we're not lawless. We have the law, but not the law of Moses. We have the law of the Spirit of life. And some of those commandments look the same. Now in Australia, you used to pay taxes to Britain when this was a British colony up to 1901. But in 1901, the law changed. And you got the Australian law. It was no longer British law. You still had to pay taxes, but no longer to the king or the queen. It's now local taxes. So some things look the same, but they are different. That's the key. Some things are different. Some things are new. Some things are amplified. Not only is it don't murder, and I'm not even supposed to become angry with my brother. Clearly there's a change in law. And what we need to do is follow the new covenant law. There's a study Bible out called the Dake Study Bible, D-A-K-E. It actually lists over 1,000 laws for the new covenant community. So are we lawless? No. Do we have laws? We have plenty. But they are different from that law code. We have a new law code, namely the law of Messiah or the law of Christ. And as such, even for us, there is a real change. There's always somebody who then says, well, what are the 10 Commandments? They surely stand, don't they? As I said, that's not true. The Sabbath is not in. So that means even the 10 Commandments are not in. And listen to the words of Paul in the letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. In 2 Corinthians 3, he talks about the ministry of death in letters engraved on stone, verse 7, that came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently on the face of Moses because of the glory of his face, fading as it was. How will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more so with glory? What does he call it? The administration of death. Engraved on stone. In comparison, this is not a law. In this chapter, verses 2 to 11, really, he deals with the law of Moses, and he says, even the 10 Commandments that was engraven on stone has been replaced. And the only one of the 10 Commandments that is not in is the 10 Commandments. Do we still have a moral law? Absolutely. Are we still under a law? Absolutely. But do we have freedom from the law? Yeah, the law of Moses we do. So what you and I should do is come together and worship. And we have that freedom. Paul says, celebrate the feast or keep the feast, depending on the translation. And he's talking about the Passover. But no longer with the yeast of malice and wickedness. So he is saying we have freedom, but we're not under that code. Do I recommend for people to eat Passover? Well, at least do it once in your life, because you'll see Christ in it very clearly. But do you have to every year? No. There's that freedom, the freedom that we have. Do we keep the Day of Atonement? Well, I don't know about you, but I don't have an altar in the back of my yard and I don't sacrifice there. No, but I do remember that Christ died for my sin, and that he is both that scapegoat that removed my sin, and the one who covered that other goat, that one that covered, atoned for my sin. And so I do remember him in the feast, but I'm not under that law code. As such, we have the freedom for you to eat the pork chop, and I'll stick to the other one. But there is no condemnation from me or from you towards one another. We have freedom at this point. Freedom to do one or the other. Galatians 6:2, the Spirit of life. That's Romans 8:2. The Spirit of life. In Colossians 6:2, it's called the law of Christ. And so we do have a law code, but we have the principle of freedom. We're not over, but we have freedom. So what is it that we do? What we need to do is follow what Paul says and celebrate. Who do we celebrate? The Lamb, Christ. The Lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world, because God foreknew what we needed. That's what he wants from us, so that we together can rejoice in him, no longer with the old, with the sinful nature, but now in Christ, getting that fullness of redemption, that fullness of grace being bestowed upon us, so that we together can come, one new man, Jew and Gentile together, not excluded and included, but one, you and me together, so that we can stand together and have that freedom. Amen?
Amen.